The American Congressional Exchange is a program that we have that BPC started where we bring two members together, a Republican and a Democrat from two very different parts of the country, and we have them visit each individual's districts and really get to know not only that member, but also that district.
Now, up until that trip, I did not know David Trone. And because of his willingness to make the trip, to come out, to spend that time with me, I can testify that I now have a friend and an ally on many issues of mutual concern.
Many of us share the same principles, and we bring to the table different life experiences, different political perspectives. We shouldn't find that dangerous or divisive. We should find it something to celebrate.
This is how America works, is by coming together, rolling up our sleeves, getting away from the partisanship, getting away from the rhetoric, and getting back to just delivering.
When you have a conversation with people and you laugh and you get to know them, you no longer see them in the same light, and you're much more willing to say, let's figure out how we can be friends and really find solutions. It creates a different type of dialogue and friendship that exists, and it also allows those members to see how different parts of the country are and how many similarities there are.
Good day, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on the future of Social Security. My name is Letty Nocera, and I am the Senior Manager of the Funding Our Future Coalition. Funding Our Future is a national coalition of more than 60 partners across the academic, nonprofit, trade association, and corporate sectors dedicated to improving retirement and financial security for all Americans. According to the latest Social Security Trustees report released last month, the program's primary trust fund is expected to deplete its reserves by 2033, 1 year earlier than previously projected. In the absence of action by Congress, this will mean a nearly 25% reduction in scheduled payments for all beneficiaries. Avoiding this fate is one of the coalition's main objectives, which is why we are pleased to partner with the Bipartisan Policy Center and welcome you to this morning's virtual event on bipartisan solutions to address the fund's solvency challenges. Before we get started, I would like to thank our coalition partners, and especially our executive partner, the Charles Schwab Foundation, for making this event possible. At this time, I am thrilled to welcome back to BPC Steve Goss, Chief Actuary at the Social Security Administration, a position he has held since 2001. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Letty. So happy to be able to be with you today for a brief rundown on the latest financial status of Social Security. If we could see the slides, please. Fantastic. And flip to the next slide, please. Great. So where are we at? Letty already mentioned that this year, the new trustees report is showing that our reserve depletion dates for the primary OESI, Religion Survivors Insurance Fund, is projected to occur 1 year earlier in 2033 versus 2034 last year. The combined OESDI trust funds are also 1 year earlier in 2034. But why? The reason is really because in December, the trustees reassessed their outlook for the future economy, foresaw some slowdown in the economy in 2023, and an expectation that the level of GDP and labor productivity would be lower by about 3% throughout the projection period compared to what we had in last year's trustees report. Next slide, please. You can see here the implications on the black and red lines. For the black is for OSDI combined, and the red line is for OSI combined. The trust fund reserve level as a percentage of annual cost of the program. You can see that it's reaching zero, that is reserve depletion, 1 year earlier in each. The good news, though, is the blue lines, the disability insurance fund, because of the very low levels of applications we've been having and continued through 2022, is actually looking in better financial condition going into the future. Next slide, please. Now, you might ask, how we've been doing on making these projections into the future. This shows you that our projected reserve depletion date for the OESDI combined funds has been quite stable, especially for the last 12 trustees reports between 2033 and 2035, with 2034 being the current projection. But the little dotted line shows you that while we've been very stable in what we've been projecting for the reserve depletion, we're getting closer to it. So it's time to be thinking seriously about action. Next slide, please. You can see here another graph that hopefully is familiar to all, showing the solid blue line is what the cost of the program is. And when you can see the solid blue line drops down to equal the red line, which is the income to the program, all as percentage of payroll, that is the point of reserve depletion. Now, the problem is the cost of paying the full scheduled benefits you see with the dashed line. The problem is that if we do deplete reserves and we do not have action by 2034, we will not be able to pay the full scheduled benefits. Benefits will be dropping. As Letty mentioned, for the combined program in 2034, it'll be dropping by 20%. So on the next slide, please. One thing to keep in mind is that we oftentimes see representations here from the president's most recent budget of the amount of borrowing from the public, federal debt borrowing from the public, and that's the black line which is typically shown. Keep in mind, though, as we saw on the prior slide, that if Social Security does deplete its reserves, it does not have borrowing authority. And in fact, there would not be under current law the ability to pay the full benefits. The black line, as you see here, typically in budget scoring, shows something which is actually representing what if there was a change in law allowing federal funds to go in and pay the difference. That is not something under current law. So the blue and red lines, the red line shows what will actually happen if we were to deplete reserves or get enough taxes to cover the scheduled benefits or enough revenue to cover it. So you can see the red line actually is more where we really will be under current law. The next graph, it's really the same thing, but this is under the CBO projections. And you can see CBO on the next slide, please. Shows actually considerably higher levels of borrowing from the public. But again, you can see on the red line, if we look at it under a pure current law basis, how that looks. Next slide, please. So this is just a little look at what we sometimes refer to as the sustainability of the program. The red line is what the cost of Social Security will be as a percentage of GDP, rising from about 4.5% up to 6%. But the question is, why? The next slide, we see the largest reason why. It's because of the changing age distribution of our population. The ratio of 65 and over population to the working age 20 to 64 is rising very rapidly now because of the drop in birth rates at the end of the baby boom period, and will stay there. And you can see the red and blue lines indicate it is really because of the drop in the drop in the fertility rate is largely responsible. But there's one other factor as to why Social Security's cost is rising relative to payroll. On the next slide, we see that actually the share since 1983 of all covered earnings, all of the earnings that we all have that are covered by Social Security that actually falls below the taxable maximum has been dropping from about 90% in 1983 down to only about 82%, 82.5% now and expected in the future. And the reason is because between 1983 and 2000, roughly, the rate of growth in average earnings for the highest 6% of earners was a lot faster than the rate of growth in earnings for the rest of earners. Next slide, please. One of the things, mortality rates, you can see the mortality rate improvement slowed down a lot after 2009. But then along came the pandemic, and you can see the bump up. We have been projecting since 2000 that mortality rates will return basically to about the trend line we had between 2000 and 2009. Some people have thought we would have much lower mortality rates, but if we look at the next slide, you can see something sort of interesting from the latest NCHS information. On the next slide, please. You can see the red line here indicates that actually mortality rates in 2020 through 2022 for all causes other than COVID have actually been higher than the mortality rates for the same quarters in the year 2019. So we are not really at a level now of having lower mortality rates for causes even other than COVID as compared to 2019, much less having a decline. Next slide, please. You can see here employment rates wonderfully have come back dramatically after the very brief 2000 recession and are projected to be at levels essentially up at the peaks in the future. A little bit of a bobble on the red lines you can see for this year's trustees report, because in December the trustees were anticipating a little bit of a slowdown in the economy in 2023. The really good news is we haven't really been seeing that so far. Next slide, please. This is just a look at when people start to receive their retirement benefits. Even in the pandemic and the 2020 recession, we did not see any change. People are moving towards higher and higher ages starting in retirement benefits, partly because of the strong economy and also because of the changing age distribution. More demand for people at higher ages to be working. Next slide, please. Disability rates mentioned before, our disability incidence rates continue to drop for many reasons, again, possibly because of the changing nature of work and also for more demand for people to stay in the labor force, whether they have some limitations or whatever. More demand for work because we have a smaller share of the population under 65. Next slide, please. And final slide, I think, here is really just an indication that in this year's trustees report, the trustees restored something we refer to as replacement rates, which really indicate for people at different earnings levels throughout their career, what share of their earnings levels will be replaced by Social Security. This is so important for retirement planning, for people to know how much they should be saving elsewhere. And the little drop you see here in 2034 is what will happen if we don't make changes to either keep the benefit levels as scheduled or make the drop less by having more revenue. And with that, I think I'm concluded, Letty. Thank you so much. And so much looking forward to hearing Jason and Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Steve. I would now like to introduce Jason Fickner, BPC's Vice President and Chief Economist, as well as Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Senator Cassidy has worked closely with BPC over the years to champion policy solutions that promote financial well-being for all Americans. As ranking member of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, he understands the urgency of addressing Social Security's financing challenges. It is an honor to have him join us today. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Letty. Senator, welcome back to the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's great to see you again. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
So let me just start right off and let's get right into it. The title of this event is, Can We Fix Social Security? So let me be point blank to you. Can we?
Yes, of course we can. But we have to redefine what the third rail is. The third rail, according to our leading presidential candidates, is that you pretend that nothing's wrong with Social Security. The third rail should be that we're going to have the 24% decrease without a borrowing capacity to address it, as Steve Goss just mentioned. If that 24% decrease goes into effect, it'll double the rate of poverty among the elderly. That should be the third rail. The conversation has to change to that. Now, next part of the answer. Okay, then how would you fix it? I've been working with a bipartisan group of senators, and Angus King, the independent who caucuses with Democrats, has been my Democratic co-lead, to come up with what we call the big idea. The big idea, which would create an investment fund separate from Social Security, not using any Social Security funds at all, separate from Social Security, and allow this investment fund to accrue returns, if you will, over 70 years, keeping it in escrow. And by doing so, we would end up with a corpus enough to address 75% of the 75-year shortfall, assuming that we ended up having to borrow, that we did give the authority to borrow to pay scheduled benefits. We think it's a really good start on a solution. Now we need leading presidential candidates to step to the plate, be honest with the American people, and help us find the additional 25%.
So, Senator, we'll probably come back to the investment trust, because I want to probably get more into that in detail, but I also want to highlight a few things that Steve Goss brought up, and also that we're seeing sort of in the political sphere right now. You know, Steve Goss mentioned that if you go back for the last 10 or 12 trustees reports, there's been a very narrow range in which they have forecast trust fund depletion. And if you go back 20 years, the range is a little wider, but it's still relatively narrow. In other words, we've known this problem is coming, and we haven't done anything about it. we are now roughly 10 years away from trust fund depletion. And as you said, the current law, because Social Security does not have borrowing authority, means the default is a benefit cut, not a tax increase, but a benefit cut of potentially up to 25%. So what makes you think now is the time to get anything done? How can we, Congress is great at kicking the can down the road to a fiscal cliff. What makes you think we can do something now?
So Jason, if you're going to say that nothing happens in DC without a deadline, of course, history would bear that out. I would argue, though, that there's a semi-deadline now. If we wait until just before the trust fund goes insolvent, it is going to be that much more difficult to address the issue. And folks always look back to 1983 and say, oh my gosh, it was just months before they went insolvent that they figured it out. Let's just do it again. A fundamental difference between now and 83 is that insolvency in 83 only caused about a 5%, if I recall correctly, a very minor amount of decreased payments to the beneficiaries. Now we have a 24% cliff. And so the deficit that we have to make up on an ongoing basis, for all the reasons Steve pointed out, is greater now than it was in 83. So it may not be that the program's going insolvent tomorrow, but I would argue that the window of opportunity to do it with minimal disruption is rapidly closing. A semi-deadline, if you will, a semi-deadline to not touch that third rail of giving the elderly senior, the elderly person, a 24% cut in the benefits which she would receive.
So it's interesting you bring this up, Senator, because back in 2016, the Bipartisan Policy Center to Commission on Retirement Security and Personal Savings, we issued a comprehensive plan that would have achieved 75-year solvency. And this is back again in 2016. We had 13 different changes to both the tax side and the benefit side. But now in 2023, that plan wouldn't close a 75-year gap. And to your point, the longer we wait, the harder it gets because the delta gets larger.
And that's why we think that we call it the big idea. The big idea is very helpful. We've had a history of kind of, oh, let's increase taxes a little bit and let's trim benefits a little bit. And it kind of runs into this kind of mutual pledges of we are not ever going to raise taxes or cut benefits that Democrats and Republicans both respectively give. But the big idea takes care of 75% of it. It gets us substantially there. And by the way, along the way, you can make the program a little bit fairer, which is always a nice thing. For my state, there's something called the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset that we could address to make those provisions fairer to our fellow Americans who are now overly penalized for these issues. But we've got to have presidential leadership. And right now, neither of the two, in fact, the Social Security policies for Biden and Trump are exactly the same, which is to do nothing and to allow a 24% decrease to happen by law.
So I think this is really important, Senator. So I'm also dismayed that our current presidential leadership has not taken the political courage to tell the American people what really is the state of the Social Security trust funds and what that actually means if Congress and the presidency do nothing. And leadership's important. So I want to thank you and your colleagues for the leadership you're taking. You've actually stuck your neck out quite a bit on this quote unquote third rail. And maybe we can sort of speak a little bit to how you and your colleagues on the other side of the aisle and also on the Republican side are trying to change that narrative. I know you've got your big idea, but sort of for people who are watching this, they often have this impression that Congress can't work together. And you're kind of proof that Congress can work across the aisle together. How are you guys working together to actually move this narrative forward so that the American people understand that we have to act now?
Yeah, with any, when I first came to Congress, I was told there's 4 Ps. See if I can get them all Ps of passing a law. There is the policy, the politics, the process, and the publicity. Now, we've got really good policy. We've been working on this for at least 2 years, and we've had multiple consultants, and we've got something scored by Steve Goss and his team. It is good policy. And the process, we think we can get the process along. The politics, right now, the leading presidential candidates who have the exact same policy, which is to do nothing, that's their policy, are dominating the publicity. We need there to be a better generalized understanding that this is a program which by law will deliver a 24% decrease in benefits in our lifetime. To not just, like someone said, well, I'm grandfathered in. No, you're not. You're going to be stuck with that 24% benefit cut like everybody else. That we need honesty from our presidential candidates, which comes with the publicity. Jason, thank you for the forum. We need more like this, and we need every reporter who's watching this to report with a banner headline, social is going insolvent, and there will be a 24% decrease. And even though Biden and Trump say it's not the case, it absolutely is.
I appreciate that. I think it's really important because, again, the messaging and the framing, you kind of had to hit it home over and over again until you hope somebody listens. And I'm going to go back to the investment trust for a moment and then ask you some follow-ups. But the investment trust, these aren't private accounts we're talking about, right? What exactly are we talking about when it comes to an investment trust?
People, both Clinton and W proposed, and W was the last president to give a serious plan to address the shortfall. But both Clinton and W had serious plans. And they both suggested using the power of the private economy to bridge the trust fund to solvency. President Clinton wanted to use surplus dollars and our Social Security trust fund dollars, as I recall. And Republicans rejected that. W wanted to create individual accounts, but would inherently allow the individual to bear the risk. Democrats rejected that. We're not using Social Security trust fund dollars, and we're not putting the risk upon the beneficiary. Under our law, the risk is borne by the fund, and the beneficiary gets her payments no matter what. Now, by the way, we're banking on the stock market to behave like it has since 1929. Which is to give roughly an 8.5% return. The actuaries actually give us an 8.3% return, an 8.5% return on average over the next 75 years. And there's a lot of history behind that. And we've got mechanisms if it doesn't happen, what to do about that, that sort of thing. But still, we're relying upon that past performance to give us some security. Now, if it turns out it doesn't give us an 8.3% return, it gives us a 8.1% of return, well, then we're not addressing 75% of the issue, we're addressing 69% of the issue. I'm making up numbers, but you see the concept. We still go a heck of a lot of the way there in order to address the shortfall. So we have a different proposal than either Clinton or W. The risk in the case to contrast with W is borne by the fund, not by the individual, and the individual is guaranteed to get her promised benefits.
Now, I know you've been working very closely with those on the other side of the aisle, but you've also been working with senators in your own party, which traditionally have opposed any sort of tax increases. And they've also been opposed to sort of government investing in the markets. How are you conveying this message to them? How are you trying to sell it to them, both the investment trust, and again, if that only makes it 75% of the difference, there's still 25% to make up, which I'm presuming is going to be some sort of combination of tax increases or benefit reductions. How are you working with Republicans on, again, you've stuck your neck out. So how are you talking to them about these issues?
Well, hell, what we say is you got a better solution, buddy? If you got a better solution, you bring it forward. Now, what we have found is that people on the left and the right will say, 15 years ago, I would not have liked this, but now we're running out of solutions. That has been heard from the left and the right. That's number one. Number two, you say, we are never going to raise taxes on seniors. We're not going to increase full retirement age on seniors, period, end of story. And then number three, you got to say that remaining 25% takes bipartisan input. It's too easy for one side to sit on the sidelines and snipe at the other. You actually have to have both sides come together to cover that last 25%. By the way, not a sort of bipartisan plan that Biden and Trump have, which is to pretend it's not a problem, to allow nothing to happen and therefore guarantee a 24% cut. No, a bipartisan plan in which people say, you know, you're taking care of 74 or 75% of the issue. You're making the system a little bit fairer for some. I think we can come together as a bipartisan basis, knowing that we're not going to raise taxes on seniors, we're not going to increase full retirement age on seniors. What can we do to cover the rest? And that's what we got to do.
I don't know if Steve Goss got into this presentation. I was watching the slides, but the cost of delay, of course, is very big. And if you go back, say, 10 years, and you just look at the tax side. So when I was the Deputy Commissioner of Social Security back in like 2008 or 9, we were doing the trustees report. At that point in time, regardless of whether you like the policy, but at that point in time, had we just eliminated the Social Security taxable maximum amount, that would have solved the 75-year solvency. Now it doesn't, right? So we're losing our options. If we just focus on payroll tax increases, 10 years ago, you'd have to raise payroll taxes by 2 percentage points, so from 12.4 to 14.4. If you wait till trust fund depletion, it'll be over a 4 percentage point increase, which would be a 33% tax increase. And again, I think this message of delaying is we're trying to get it out there. And I hope the media picks up your point, and I hope President Biden starts understanding this, and whoever the presidential candidate on the Republican side does too, because the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. And I think what I'd also like to ask you to talk about a little bit is, assuming we can get an investment trust as part of the package that you have, what other options besides the WEP GPO issues would you think are important from a bipartisan standpoint to get a comprehensive package through the Congress?
Well, I even hesitate to speak on that, because if I even allude to it, Jason, people will say, well, that's part of the plan. And whatever, and it's too easy for people to be cowards and to hide behind, well, I'm never going to do that. I'm pure and you're not pure. What we know is we've solved 75% of the plan. There's another 25%. And it's going to take a give and take on both sides. We're not going to raise taxes on seniors. We're not going to increase the time for them to achieve full retirement age. So what can we do? Just put that out there. Steve Goss talked about some stuff. Steve Goss mentioned that in 1983, and by the way, in 1936, when the program was started, that Social Security addressed, the payroll tax addressed 90% of wage income. That has deteriorated to 83%. You just mentioned how if a certain time ago, if you had kept that 1983 Reagan-O'Neill agreement at 90%, we would be having a far different discussion. Are people interested in that? Well, that's something you have to do on a bipartisan basis. Anybody, though, that claims purity, that I'm not going to do anything because, oh my gosh, I'm not going to touch social. That just means that you are guaranteeing a 24% cut to people who are currently receiving social, and that our poverty rate among the elderly will double. It is not only cowardice, it is wrong for the American people.
And there's also a generational issue here that I think we've kind of left out, which is if we go to some sort of reform that includes benefit reductions and tax increases, the current younger workers here are going to get hit twice as hard because they're going to pay more in taxes and get less benefits when they retire. And that story is not getting out as much either. I mean, I'm sure you talk to a lot of people in your state because you're senators, you have the whole state and your constituents, span the age, all the way from young to old. When you talk to younger people, how do you convey this message to them that it actually, Social Security is also about them? It's not just about the current elderly.
If you speak to Gen Xers, they're kind of nihilistic. If you look at the polling, like 70% of them don't think that they're going to get social. If you go down, they're not thinking about it as much, but if they are thinking about it, they're almost equally kind of like pessimistic that they're going to actually receive something. And that's important. I was told recently that if you're currently age 60, you have about a 50% chance of living to 90. But if you're currently age 30, you have about a 50% chance of living to be 100. If there's anyone whom we should be really concerned about their long-range retirement, the contribution that social makes to that, particularly for our fellow Americans who are less well off, knowing that they're now going to spend maybe 40% of their life after age 60, it should be those younger folks. Which again, if I sound like I'm doing a broken record, it's because I am. That's why we need leadership from our leading presidential candidates, not hiding behind fake claims of purity because they refuse to address it.
Yeah, I think it's also important to point out that, the title of the program is the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Programs, right? So there's one that's an insurance, it's an old age insurance program. But two, there's also disability. And you mentioned talking to younger people. One of the, Steve Goss and I've been on this for a while, mentioning to people, reminding them that it's not just a retirement program, it's survivors, but also disability. And for a lot of young people today, there's either a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 4 chance at some point in their life they'll be disabled. And that insurance program is there for them as well. So when we start thinking about trying to make sure this program is around for generations, it's not just the retirement part, it's also the disability part that's important too.
Absolutely. Now, we've seen that the disability fund is doing relatively well, but one thing I don't think Steve mentioned is that there's an inverse relationship between the strength of the economy in terms of hiring people and the relationship between those applying for disability. And so this current, decreased application for disability, totally consistent with that inverse relationship. So we can't, presume that will continue like that. Although the nature of work changing obviously is going to positively impact that. So there is some silver lining, but even if you put the two funds together, it only extends the life of Social Security solvency by 1 year. So we're going to address this issue. You can pay me now or pay me later. In this case, it's only 1 year later.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very key point, Senator, to hit home for people who are listening, is that even though the DI program has a depletion date outside the 75-year window, those reserves only buy you 1 year of OASI time. So, and again, it's very sensitive to economic conditions. When recessions happen, et cetera, sometimes applications can go up. So, and awards and allowances. So it's important to keep that in mind, that we do have to still look at the DI program as well, the disability, not just the retirement. I want to also highlight some of the work you've been doing on a bipartisan basis that actually has produced legislation I think is very important. Because again, there's a lot of, when I go out and do talks, people say Congress can't do anything. And I've got to go, well, partly yes, but partly no, they do something. And at the same time that you've been working very hard to tackle the issue of solvency, I know we've been working closely with your team at BPC and your staff on efforts to improve America's decisions surrounding when to claim Social Security benefits, because that claiming decision is so important and can have a huge impact on people's financial security and retirement. You've actually introduced a couple of bills in this recently, working with Senators Susan Collins, Chris Coons, and Tim Kaine to improve the information people have when they make that decision. Can you tell us a bit about those bills and why you feel it's such an important issue?
I'm a teacher from way back, and so I always like to think that education is ultimately how we get to a better place. But if you can educate people that it's almost always in their it's financially better for them to delay claiming their benefit from the earliest age, which is now 62, ideally to age 70, but certainly until age 67, they're going to do financially better. Now, if somebody has terminal cancer at age 62, they're going to want to claim. But the more you delay, the better. And we're attempting to educate more Americans about it is a wiser financial decision to delay. Now, I was heartened because Steve pointed out that the claiming age is increasing. That's a positive thing. And so that's a really positive thing. But I suspect that if you look at our fellow Americans who are less well off, you're going to find that they still disproportionately claim at an earlier age, probably because they start off being poor to begin with and they need the money. But the degree that they can continue to work for a while, supporting themselves and delay when they begin to claim, it's in their why it's better for them financially in the long run too. And that's what we're trying to promote.
I think one of the things to highlight for the audience is sort of the behavioral economics of this. Like we talk about solvency, it's an investment trust, or it's changing the tax rate or payroll taxes. So you're changing taxes, or you're changing benefits. With the bills we're talking about here, we're not changing sort of anything about the benefit structure, the tax structure. To your point, we're changing the education. And so an example, is Social Security calls age 62, which you're right, is the modal age of claiming. More people claim at age 62 than any other individual age, about 30% claim at 62. And we call it the early eligibility age. And people hear early eligibility and think it's like getting in line early for a movie or a brunch. No one wants to be late to their benefits, but they don't understand that the early eligibility is actually the minimum benefit. And your bill would actually change the naming of the early eligibility age to the minimum benefit age and change what we call the full retirement age or normal retirement age, because I'm not sure what normal is anymore, to standard retirement age. And then talk about age 70 as the maximum benefit age. And I think to your point, Senator, the education is so important, but imagine someone who goes into a Social Security field office and says, I'm at age 62, when should I claim benefits? And Social Security says, well, you're age 62. that is the minimum benefit you get, as opposed to early eligibility, how that could change a conversation. And I think that's really important that you're putting this bill out and having this conversation with the American public.
And I will say as well, thank you, Jason, for giving more detail. I'll also say that the Social Security website has a nice benefit calculator in which people can go on, put their claiming date and see what their lifetime benefits are. Now, one thing I would ask them to do, I created a spreadsheet separately. And on my spreadsheet, I calculated, okay, if I live to be 80, at what point will I receive more in total, not net present value, but just in total relative to claiming earlier. I think that would be a little helpful too. Maybe I should write a bill on that, huh? But that would just be a little bit of a spreadsheet to the side because people can say, well, yeah, it's a little bit more, but I'm claiming for 7 years more if I start here as opposed to claim there. But that helped me and my wife as we're making those decisions.
I think it's also important, we should talk about we have about 10 minutes left or so, Senator. Social Security as an agency, there have been a lot of recent news reports coming out of Washington Post, New York Times, even some of the unions, about declining standards of customer service at the Social Security Administration. And I know we all care about customer service and we care about the stewardship and administration of these programs. Does this just come down to funding at Social Security? Are there other concerns here? How can Congress help? Should there be more oversight hearings, different allocation of resources? What are your thoughts as a senator on how to help Social Security do a better job administering the program and also helping on customer service levels?
Couple of things. First, let me just praise Steve Goss's outfit. They've been helpful to work with. We don't have a final score yet, but they've been great. So if you look at that aspect of it, the actuaries have been very helpful. And I just want to give a shout out. We've learned a lot. We've got a lot more to learn from them. And one day we'll have a final score and I'll be able to say, whoa, thank you, Steve Goss. Secondly, as regards interfacing with the public, part of the problem during the pandemic, they had a work from home policy, but the records were so sensitive, people could not take them from home. And so effectively, there was no work being done for quite some period of time. That, of course, creates backlogs and poor customer service. I don't know if that's funding as much as it is pandemic, it is union rules, because it seems from my perception that persisted long after it had to persist, and then now having to catch up from a backlog. There are some dedicated employees at the Social Security Administration. The woman who does that sort of thing says, I know who to call. Implicit in that is there's a few people whom she chooses not to call. So that's up to management. If there's some folks who are not giving that sort of service, then they should be moved to a different position where they have a better strength, or if they, for whatever reason, are not good employees, they should be dismissed. Ultimately, we're here to serve the public, not to provide employment for people.
Yeah, that's a fair point, Senator. I appreciate that. Are you planning on holding hearings though, more hearings on Social Security Administration to get some of these answers out to the public on the congressional record?
Until we get, again, one more time, until we get a commitment from a White House that says we're going to work on it, we're not going to have a public hearing. It's just going to be a punching bag for somebody running for re-election or somebody running for election. This is too important a topic. We cannot get anything passed into law unless it's signed into law by a president. And now we have two presidential candidates who are pretending there is no problem. I don't think we'll have a hearing before then because it's very easy to sit on the sidelines and to say, no, I'm pure. I'm going to protect your social, when we know their plan to do nothing cuts social benefits by 24%. Until we have a president who has the courage to step forward, I don't think we'll have a hearing.
I think that's a good point, Senator. And also, I think it's worthwhile pointing out to the audience that the current commissioner is an acting commissioner, and the president has not nominated anyone to fill that position on a permanent basis. So not only is there no presidential leadership about reform and solvency, but there's not actually a commitment for someone to run the agency full-time and a full-time nomination to go before the Senate and talk about the agency.
And Jason, if anybody thinks I'm being partisan, I think I'm being very bipartisan in my criticism. Because neither candidate, neither Trump nor Biden, are showing the courage to acknowledge that there's an issue which must be addressed.
I hope you continue saying that in public, Senator, as the presidential debates kick off when they do sort of next year, because I think it's going to be very important to have leaders in the Senate who can step forward on a bipartisan basis and tell both parties that they have to stand up and have an honest conversation with the American people about this.
But Jason, let me flip that. Who's ever watching needs to demand it as well.
Yeah.
If you're watching right now I'm a little bit of a voice in the wilderness. Jason is not just a voice in the wilderness, let's just pursue that. He's really in the wilderness. What we need is for this to become a conversation among thought leaders, and those of you on this call are almost by definition such. Whether you're a reporter or you're a think tank or you're just a citizen who cares about the issue, then you have the ability to connect with others. In one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, he spoke about tipping points. And the tipping point doesn't, maybe there's a person on TikTok now who influences a lot, an influencer, if you will. But it takes that culmination of many influencers to flip the conversation. And right now, we need that sort of tipping point to come to this dialogue where folks understand the real third rail should be doing nothing.
So let's take a few more minutes while we have and go back to your big idea, because I think that's something that people are going to be really curious to talk more about after this session. Reporters are probably going to reach out about the investment trust. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the borrowing authority. Who would invest the money? Maybe that's it. Is Steve Goss going to invest this money in the market? Am I going to do it? How would this sort of structure work? And then give a little bit of discussion to, I know you have some triggers in case it doesn't make up 75% of the solvency, what those triggers might look like. Are they tax increases, benefit cuts? Maybe spend a few minutes on that while we wrap up.
Yeah, so let's first speak about the paradigm in general. There was a study, I think it's from the Urban Institute, or I don't have my slide in front of me, but someone such as that, which points out that every funded pension fund has 60% of their assets in non-governmental securities, in the market, if you will. Currently, by law, the Social Security Trust Fund keeps all of its investment in either treasuries or cash. Most of those treasuries are yielding 1%, 2%, and 3% in an environment where we have a 7% rate of inflation. So the Social Security Trust Fund has the absolute worst investment strategy you could have right now. Low interest bearing trust funds. It is the Silicon Valley Bank of pension funds with an investment strategy inadequate for a high inflation environment. But on the other hand, buying securities outside of treasuries, equity market, for example, is what private pension funds have been doing, and public pension funds elsewhere in the world. And by the way, federal employees, whether it is the TSP, the Thrift Savings Plan, which is what federal employees are in, or the railroad retirement system, they have their assets in the general market, investing in the overall economy. With that, there is a rate of return which far exceeds the 1%, 2%, and 4% return in the Social Security Trust Fund, in which on average you're getting anywhere from 8.3 to 10.5. I mentioned the 10.5. 20 years ago, the Canadian pension fund was in the red with more beneficiaries than people paying in as a ratio. And they went into a market-based strategy. They've averaged 10.5% since, again, off the top of my head, and they've gone from being in the red to firmly in the black. Other national pension funds are the same. Ontario Teachers Fund, 20 years ago, deeply in the red, now firmly in the black because of pursuing a diversification away from low yielding investment vehicles into a more general market strategy. So whenever anybody says, oh, isn't it risky to be in the market? We point out that it's risky not to be in the market, because every fund which takes the risk of not being in the market goes deeply in the red. As regards a backstop, that's all negotiable. We have ideas, okay, what if we don't get the yield we need? And we have ideas, and we're working on language of that. But that really will come down to the bipartisan working group. Once a president decides to show leadership, and there's a bipartisan group of legislators that would come together, we would come up with a strategy, and we have one to propose, but it has to be bipartisan, in which, okay, you're not getting your market returns, what do you do? That is so easily worked out. Last thing I'll address, okay, how do we keep government from using this position in the market to influence the private market? We have put in arm's length strategy to prevent that. We had Heritage Foundation give us advice. I'm not saying they're endorsing our overall proposal, but they gave us advice in terms of how to avoid that. We had David Walker, the last comptroller of a former comptroller and a former director of Social Security, give us advice to make it even stronger, in which there would be an arm's length between any future Congress and how these funds are managed. And we also say that if Congress interferes in such a way as to plausibly decrease the yield on the investment, that Congress must increase payroll taxes commensurate with that decrease in future yield. And we think that would be the ultimate way, because Congress never wants to raise taxes. So we attempt to address all those, but some of those, I say once more, it's going to require a president to provide leadership in bringing a bipartisan group together to avoid this 24% cut that's scheduled to occur.
I appreciate that, Senator. I think that's actually the key words to end on is leadership. And so one, I want to thank you for the leadership you're taking on this very important issue, and also the public role you're taking to tell other leaders that they need to take a stand as well. So thank you for that as well. And thank you for your time today. I also want to thank Steve Goss for his time earlier, and for folks in the audience. If you Google Social Security Chief Actuary, you can go to their webpage at Social Security, and they score various proposals, legislation, so you can see what various things do to help us get towards trust fund solvency. And I want to thank Letty Nocera for kicking us off today as well, and the Bipartisan Policy Center and funding our future for this event. And again, Senator, thank you so much for your time. And for folks in the audience, thank you for joining us. We appreciate everything for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.